Hello, everyone. Gary from Timeline Astrology here. This is a presentation all about revolutions and uprisings and what I think will be major uprisings in the world, in major nations in the world by mid-decade. So I'm calling it Revolution 2.025. Obviously, it's the play on words, 2.0, 2025. And so let's get into this. Before we do, I want to just put a disclaimer in here and that this is for entertainment purposes only. I have to say that in a way, but in another way, I think it's true. That is all entertainment. That an imagined future should never take the place of your current experience, sitting here wherever you are, and just in your body, in your breath, in the moment. That's all that's real. Anything else is just mind stuff. So if you consider that, whatever I say here, because I'm going to talk about things that are quite potentially, fear-inducing, especially I think anytime we look at the future, it has the potential to create fear, even if it's a positive expectation. We might call it excitement, but it is also still somewhat a level of fear. And that's one of the pitfalls of astrology, unfortunately. And we need to be mindful of that and maybe just put that aside and use astrology for what it's best used for, which is just being more aware of where we are in the current period and to use astrology like a timing tool without getting fixated on the future. Having said that, it's good to be prepared. And so just again, put it in your diary, put it in your kind of mental diary in a way, in your calendar, and think about it in terms of the longer term timelines here. And then perhaps you can plan around it better, again, without getting lost in all of these things, because it's all, again, just mind stuff. Nobody really knows what's going to happen, obviously. So it's best to watch this if you're feeling more centered. If you're not feeling centered right now, I would suggest you pause this video and save it and come back to it later. Another thing to mention is that I do use sidereal calculations. I do use the tropical. I do look at the tropical as well, but I use mostly the sidereal calculations. So that's something to be mindful of. You'll see changes here, obviously with sign, but also in terms of returns, like Pluto returns, like Uranus returns. These shift because of the sidereal calculations. So anyway, I won't get into that. But revolutions, first of all, what are they? Why do they happen? And why did they continue to happen? And essentially, that is because of inequality. Essentially, why would anyone want to revolt a system if it was looking after everybody? It doesn't obviously look after everybody. The rich get richer, the poor get poorer. And it takes a kind of extreme divide between those two when people revolt. People are not going to rise up and revolt and, try and crash the system, as it were, unless the system is not at all doing anything for them. And that happens when there's catastrophe, that when there's wars, of course, more especially pandemics or natural disasters like earthquakes, like volcanoes that set things off and that create challenges for people. When people don't have enough, then people revolt. I mean, you've got nothing left to lose at that point. So I want to just highlight one thing here because historically, this has happened with an Icelandic volcano, which is interesting because we're seeing a volcano at this time is again in Iceland. But historically, the French Revolution actually was begun because of, in a roundabout way, of an Icelandic volcano. And that might seem mind-boggling in a way, but if you just hear me out, basically, a volcano in Iceland that was set off for months on end. It was like 8 months in total. Sent plumes of ash and smoke over Europe, and it destroyed all the crops in Europe. And in France at the time, there was already an inequality. Again, the rich get richer, the poor get poorer. So there was already an imbalance in society. And then it took this catastrophe, essentially, and all the crops ruined for people to have nothing then, and then have nothing to lose. And that's when they rose up, and that's when the French Revolution began. And I'm going to show you that in terms of some of the transits and how we're having some of those same similar themes coming around again. And so it's all cyclical. All of these are patterns that come around again and again, different faces, different places, but essentially it's the same theme. And why we have revolutions could be for many different reasons. And whether it's a natural disaster this time around again, or war or war, all of the above, you might say, then we can see that, with the climate issue right now with, wildfires and flooding. Flooding, I think, is going to be a major one. I'm going to talk about why I think that is the case for the next few years because of a certain conjunction. But again, it's all repeating patterns in a sense, and this widening gap between the rich and poor. The importance of looking at the outer planets, of course, that we have to look at the outer planets if we're looking at these big mundane events, these big world themes. So Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. A lot of Indian astrologers don't use them and substitute Rahu and Ketu. But really, you're missing a big piece of the puzzle here on if you don't use Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. And because they're so slow moving, you know, we keep an eye on these for big world events. I mean, the slowest that you can use in the traditional Indian system is Saturn. But even though it's slow, it still like takes 2.5 years to move through a sign. It's not that slow. Compared to Uranus, the fastest of these three, it takes 7 years to move through a sign. And Neptune takes 14 years, twice as long, and Pluto like up to 30 years. So these are like big changes that happen over longer periods of time. And we're going to look at these three. But we're also going to look at Rahu and Ketu because we need to look at all of them to see the whole picture. And because the outer planets, even though we don't see them with our eyes, they are, there, of course, and we feel them, we sense them, and we see the changes that they bring about in society over a long period of time. The same with the nodes. We don't see them, we sense them, and maybe you might say we see them during an eclipse. And I'm going to show you as well eclipses that are particularly pertinent for the US, but they create changes sort of unbeknownst to us. They create changes sort of underneath the surface of things, but they drive evolution because of that. And what is the one driver essentially of a revolution, if we just stick to the theme of revolution, is this sense of Rahu representing greed and Ketu representing the flip side of that and loss. So you can't have one without the other with the nodes, Rahu and Ketu. And Rahu shows this intense need for something and greed, like a gold rush, like we're seeing right now in the tech rush in the markets. People are all buying into this sort of this market crazy thing that's going on. And that eventually is going to lead to major losses. I mean, you don't need an astrologer to tell you that, but it's essentially the story of Rahu and Ketu always. And it's a repeating story. And the fact that we don't see it repeating over and over again means that we get caught in the loop of it and that we get caught in the sort of mayhem and madness of Rahu over and over again. And that eventually leads to Ketu and losses again and again. So this is what Rahu and Ketu are doing in the next few years. They're currently in Pisces, Virgo, sidereal, until May 2025. And that is important because it's in the lead up to what I think is going to be set off in the summer of 2025. And I'll show you why I believe that with the other transits. But this is happening in the background now with Pisces, Virgo been activated. And water is a big theme here. And as we talk about when we see Saturn, Neptune come together in Pisces, that's going to be the beginning of the end of many systems that we currently rely on. So things are going to start falling apart in many ways. Now, in other ways, I think there's going to be revolutions in some places, whether it's Russia or wherever it might be. I do think Russia is one of the main countries that I see being affected by the upcoming Saturn-Neptune conjunction. But Rahu currently is already stirring it, essentially, is what I mean. And Ketu in Virgo, which is kind of like removing the basics sort of thing. Rahu in Pisces is exaggerating and distorting the Piscean thing. And this is going to continue now until May 2025. So it's the preamble essentially up to summer of 2025. But then what happens is Rahu goes into Aquarius and Ketu goes into Leo. And this is when it gets set off. Because Rahu in Aquarius, Ketu in Leo, every 18.5 years, that cycle is going to start again. And at a time when Saturn is going to come together with Neptune in Pisces, but also Ketu will conjoin Mars, as we'll see in Leo. So it's like there's definitely with Ketu and Leo, this removing of people in power. And then Rahu in Aquarius, power to the people. And Rahu transiting Aquarius is certainly going to show that kind of revolutionary stance. So the potential for revolutions, I think, are going to be more so in Russia, but I'm going to look at the American chart and the China chart that I have. I don't have a good Russia chart that I'm confident with. There are some charts floating around, but I'm not really super confident with it. But I'm going to show you some dates anyway in Russian history that highlight what is this essentially main theme of why I see there's a revolution. Apart from the nodes, apart from, well, all of the planets that I'm going to show you, there's so much going on. This one is the main one. Saturn-Neptune conjunctions. This is an integral part of the Russia story. So the fact that they're meeting though in Pisces from 2025 until 2027 is really important because they're opposite where they were when many of our world leaders, current world leaders, were born, when Saturn and Neptune conjoined in Virgo. Putin is one of them. He was born when Saturn-Neptune conjoined in Virgo. Xi Jinping is another one. He has an exact Saturn-Neptune conjunction in Virgo. The other one is the American independence chart. It was formed at the time that Saturn and Neptune conjoined many times before then. So all of them then, America, China, and Russia are all affected by this Saturn-Neptune conjunction opposite in Pisces. And Pisces is all about ending things. It's about dissolving things. And it's more especially Saturn and conjoined Neptune is about dissolving the current structure and complete reform. I mean, I don't even know what it's going to look like, of course, but I know that there are things that are going to start to end in a kind of very rapid way, I would say, from 2025 to 2027. So this is the key thing, that when Saturn and Neptune conjoin in Pisces, Mars and Ketu are going to conjoin in Leo in June, July. The exact conjunctions are in July for Mars, Ketu, but that whole period, Saturn and Neptune are together, June, July of 2025. This is where it all gets set off, I would say. And Mars Ketu conjunctions always set things off anyway. The last time they conjoined was October 2023. That was when Hamas invaded Israel. And so that set off all of that. The fact that now we're going to see this again in Leo, the fiery Leo of governments, of leaders. And at the same time that Saturn and Neptune come together in Pisces, we're already seeing this potential because of Saturn, Neptune being in a watery sign. And now the wars that are being fought on the ocean. We're not just seeing it in Gaza, we're also seeing it in Ukraine. That actually the war seems to be now being fought more so with ships. And so we're going to see that. And also Pisces right now being transited by not just Neptune, but Rahu. We're seeing everything sort of getting stirred up now, and it's going to lead to this by 2025. But Saturn and Neptune are going to conjoin again the following year, 2026, February of. So it's going to be like over a 2-year period. That span of 2 years is going to be a lot of things that are just going to like dissolve completely. So let's get into the Russian story, because I do think that the Russian story is more important here in terms of this storyline of Saturn Neptune and how that might lead to reform in Russia and maybe even a collapse of the current regime. I don't know if there's going to be an uprising revolution, as has been in history, in its current, guys, I just don't know if that's even a potential that people will revolt against. I mean, they've just voted Putin in with a landslide, however that went. But I don't see it, but I do see something ending. That's the thing. I don't know if it's just whatever happens, it's going to happen, but maybe it's a natural disaster. Maybe it's something natural that happens. But I do think there's going to be the ending or the beginning of the end of the Russian regime from 2025 onwards. So here we see historical conjunctions all connected to Russia. And I'm just focusing on Russia now, okay? So if we go back all the way back to the turn of the 19th century, I could go way back. I mean, I've gone way, way, way back. And every single time Saturn Neptune came together, it's had implications for Russia, changes in Russia in a big way. But let's just start with 1809. So that was the Russo-Swedish War. Now, that might get your ears pricked up because, of course, Sweden has just joined NATO. That's not a coincidence. But Sweden just joining NATO and, this Saturn-Neptune conjunction coming up, that's a repeating pattern, you might say. I mean, I do think that if there was any way I could see the Russian regime collapsing, is that they spread themselves too thinly. I mean, you can see what's happened in Ukraine. They thought it was going to be a walk in the park, and it's not. It's ongoing. If they were to spread themselves too thinly and other countries get involved, I just think that is going to lead to the collapse of the current regime in Russia more than anything. But that's just my opinion. I don't know. We can just wait and see how it plays out. The next time they came together, and by the way, Saturn and Neptune come together every 36, 37 years, was 1846, and that was the Russian rule of Kazakhstan. So this is another big theme of Saturn and Neptune, and even more, I think, in Pisces. It dissolves boundaries, it moves borders even with countries. That's Saturn Neptune. And you can see that changing of borders, literally. That might be another thing with Ukraine. I don't know if that's shifting again. I don't know, or it's other countries involved. Who knows? but that could be another theme. It's interesting as well, though, at the time that Neptune itself was discovered with a telescope in 1846, around that period. So Saturn is the most outer boundary we can see, remember, and Neptune obviously goes beyond there. And it's interesting how during their conjunction, Neptune was discovered and we found a new boundary, a new dimension of space in our solar system, at least. So that's just an interesting one. We might see kind of themes like that again, because they're conjoining in Pisces. I think even more, we're going to see another boundary exploration of some further out boundary in space, perhaps. But back here on Earth, we're probably going to see again boundary issues, border issues, a major issue around the world, not just Russia, around the world. And also because it's Pisces, water issues and water logging and floods and all of that, and literally borders, boundaries being flooded, I would say. I mean, you can see what happened in Pakistan. I mean, much of the country is still underwater. And you can see that that's going to happen in other parts of the world as well in the next few years. So anyway, the next time they were together was 1882, and that was when Russia passed these May laws, they were called, and basically they restricted the movement of Jews, and Jews couldn't buy land, and there was this restriction that was put in place. It's so interesting to see how Saturn-Neptune creates this theme, whether it's in Putin himself or Xi Jinping, this kind of need to kind of contain people and the fear of losing control, especially because they have it in Virgo. And this fear of control and this need to control everybody. That's a Saturn-Neptune theme. The next time they came together was 1917. That was the Russian Revolution, the Bloody Civil War. I mean, that speaks for itself. Saturn-Neptune conjoined. Of course, all of these conjunctions would really depend on what else is going on at the time, what transits, but I'm not going to show you all of the charts just to keep it simple. This is just a repeating one signature in the chart. The next time, in 1952, the death of Stalin, obviously that had huge implications for the Soviet Union at the time. And then 1989, the end of the Soviet Union. That was the very last time that Saturn-Neptune conjoined. You might think, oh, that in my lifetime, that seems like a long time ago, 1989, but actually historically and astrologically, that wasn't that long ago. It's the last time they met. They haven't met since. This is the next time that they're going to meet in 2025 and 2026 on 2 occasions over those 2 years. And so what are we going to see in Pisces? We're, again, likely to see the dissolving, the ending of those systems, those Russian or China or wherever it might be, and the changes that are going to happen in the US and elsewhere. And flooding issues and all of those things are going to be natural disasters that probably lead to more upheaval, I would say, on the planet. So to speak of Pluto, it's important because we want to know what's going on in the background. Pluto is like the background hum. It's not obvious at all. We don't see Pluto. We need to look at its dispositor, its ruling planet, in this case, Saturn, to know what's going on and to see what Saturn's doing to get a bigger, a better picture of it. But I'm using again sidereal, so it's obviously just moved into tropical Aquarius, but it's still in sidereal Capricorn, still dissolving, ending the current system, whatever system it is, banking, working system. Like we're never going to work the same again with Pluto and Capricorn now. And as Pluto moved into Capricorn, of course, in 2020, it moved in with Saturn and Jupiter, and it collapsed the whole thing, right? But again, we have to look at Saturn because Saturn moved out by 2023, initially in 2022, and then finally in 23. And Saturn is now in Aquarius. So it's very hurriedly, or as hurriedly as Saturn can at least, implementing new systems, like putting in new tech systems and new AI systems to offset the sort of breaking down of the old way of doing things in Capricorn. But Pluto is in Capricorn for 20 years until 2040. So that is a continual story. Now, add in the fact that Saturn is going to go into Pisces by 2025 to 27, and that is going to erode the system further. So now when we add them together, Pluto and Capricorn continually breaking down from the inside out, eroding the system essentially, and it eventually collapses. And it could happen quite quickly as well. It's like it seems to slowly happen over a long time, but we don't see it happening. And then for most people don't, see it happening. And so we might say, oh, that just collapsed very quickly, but really it's been eroding for a long time with Pluto. But we might be more obviously aware of the Saturn story like we are right now with the Saturn in Aquarius and the tech and the AI revolution, essentially. So there's going to be many changes because of these two transits now, Pluto and Saturn in Pisces. But let's not forget Jupiter. Jupiter has a big role to play in revolutions, believe it or not. Jupiter moving into Cancer by the end of 2025 is another trigger. It's going to move in by the end of 25, but then also the summer of 26 to the end of 26, and then again in 2027. It's going to do this in and out thing that it actually did in Capricorn in 2020, 2021. It's going to do it again in 25, 26 into 27. And this is going to be interesting because although exalted in Cancer, it's opposite Pluto. And let me give you an example of this because it's happened historically. This was also when we saw the beginning of the French Revolution, when Jupiter moved into Cancer and Pluto had almost finished its transit in Capricorn. So again, we're having repeating patterns. Pluto has come around again after 250 years or so, moved into Capricorn. That's again the beginning of the end of the system. But then it didn't end when Jupiter moved into Capricorn. It did shut down everything in 2020, and it didn't end it, by the way, back then as well, during, or before the French Revolution. It ended it when Jupiter moved into Cancer in exaltation, because you're not going to have people rise up and revolt unless they have a belief, that's Jupiter, or a hope even, that's Jupiter exalted in Cancer, that it's going to lead to something. So this is where I think the trigger is in 2025. If it hasn't happened by the summer of 2025, I do believe it's going to happen by the end of 25 into 26, 27. This whole time Jupiter's in Cancer, Saturn is conjoined Neptune in Pisces, remember, in a trine. So it almost like helps out this sort of the revolutionaries, essentially. Yeah. So here's some charts, a couple of charts at least. This is the Republic of China. This is a good chart. We have a good time for 1949. I just want to highlight this in terms of the ascendant and the moon here at 8 and 9 degrees of Capricorn, sidereal, of course, and how Pluto is now at 7 degrees. So Pluto in the coming years, next few years, during this whole time is going to conjoin, is going to transit the ascendant and the moon. The moon is the seventh lord in a country's chart that is all about international relations, or in this case, the lack thereof. So what's happening? Of course, we can see that Pluto is basically destroying China's international relations. And you might say reforming it, right, with other countries. And what is interesting is that even though I'm not going to show you a Russian chart, I do have one Russian chart that basically has Cancer rising, which means that Pluto is in the seventh sign by transit. And again, the same theme, it's destroying its international relations. And when I showed the US chart, independence chart, it's a seventh house transit as well, but not Pluto, it's Uranus. So that's interesting for both China and Russia. There's this implication here of Pluto changing, at least, and maybe destroying is a very strong word, but it does seem to be destroying their international relations with, other countries. So for the US, it's not just a Pluto return for the US independence chart, it's also a Uranus return, because Uranus is going to move into Taurus, sidereal Taurus, by June 1st of 2024. Uranus is in Taurus in the independence chart. Pluto is in Capricorn in the independence chart. Both are returning. And there's more than that, but I'll show you that in a minute. But those two are going to set things off. And while Pluto is returning this year, by the way, it's already started the process. It returned in February of 2024, according to the sidereal calculations. It will return again in August and December. But essentially, this is a slow burn with Pluto, remember. Uranus is a faster one. So it's going to probably trigger something more immediately, even though it's a slow transit. In another way, it's 7 years in a sign. But in Taurus, it's going to get triggered by Mars in July of 2024. And even before then, in March and in April, Mars in Aquarius is square aspecting Taurus and Uranus therein. Not just the Uranus of the independence chart, but remember now the Uranus that's returning to where it was. So by transit, Mars is triggering both of these. And Mars will conjoin both of these, as in Mars will conjoin Uranus in the sky in July 2024, but it will also conjoin the Uranus in the independence chart in July of 2024. This is a trigger. This is like setting a match to this fuel. And you might say actually that the fuel is Pluto, that the match is Uranus, and Mars is striking the match. So we've got all of those things triggered. It's the perfect situation here for striking um, and blowing something up. So for the US, obviously that's worrisome, to say the least, because the last time Uranus, and by the way, Jupiter is also conjoining Uranus as they move into Taurus. The last time that happened was 1941. 1941 was when the US entered World War II after Pearl Harbor. So surprise attacks, that's Uranus, Jupiter, and that aspect from Mars and that trigger from Mars later on in the summer also. So that's all worrisome, of course. But our only hope at the moment is that Saturn in Aquarius and its aspect to Aries, where Uranus and Jupiter are finishing out their transit, until then, is holding things back. We can only hope that Saturn will win out, essentially. That fear, really, and the fear of the repercussions of doing such will win out, essentially. But there's more. So Neptune. So we already have a Pluto return for the US independence chart, which I'll show you now. We have a Uranus return for the independence chart, but we now also have Neptune in Pisces, where it was during the American Civil War. So the American Civil War happened between 1861 and 65, but Neptune was in Pisces that whole period before and after then, from 1857 to 1871. It takes 14 years to move through a sign. It's back here again from 2023 to 2037. Neptune in Pisces is a signature in the US chart anyway for Civil War. And what else do you see? You see that Jupiter is in Cancer, exalted in a trine to Neptune. Again, nobody is going to stand up or get up and revolt and get out onto the streets and have a revolution unless they have a hope that in their hearts, that's Jupiter in Cancer, that it's going to lead to something better. So this is when I think it's all going to get triggered. Again, when Jupiter moves into Cancer, it won't be until the end of 2025, but it'll continue then in 26 and into 2027, all the while that Saturn and Neptune conjoin in Pisces. So this is the American independence chart. This is the sidereal chart. Remember, tropical astrologers use Sagittarius. I use Scorpio. You have to subtract 23, 24 degrees at present. At the time, it would have been less, but you can see here Scorpio. It has to be Scorpio at that time of day. Most people use this time at 10 past 5. Most people use 5 or 10 past 5 in the evening for the Sibley chart. So you can see Pluto is returning. It's at 6 degrees. It's actually reached 7 degrees at the moment. Uranus is about to move into Taurus where it was. This is the trigger. 2 triggers there. Neptune, again, remember it's in Pisces. That was a trigger for the Civil War. Jupiter is going to move into Cancer, where Rahu and Mercury are in this chart. And that's interesting because currently the dasha, or the time period for this particular chart that's active, is Rahu and Saturn until, you guessed it, July of 2024. July of 2024, the chart changes to Rahu Mercury. So Rahu Saturn is, well, Saturn is more restrained, shall we put it that way? Fearful perhaps, but in the country's chart, this is just restrained. Rahu Mercury is retrograde Mercury, yes, so there might be some hesitation there, but it's more complicated. It's going to create a lot more complicated situations, and it's opposition to Pluto in the 3rd house there from the 9th house. There are going to be a lot of complexities going on in the US, which suggests really not so much, maybe war. Well, I do think that war is there, but long term. But I do think that this is more like infighting and a lot of legal issues. Of course, it's 9th house, and then battling out in other ways. And, without using the phrase civil war, perhaps in our modern context, because that might be a bit dramatic, it is a civil war in all but boots on the ground and guns in the air, essentially. And so I think that we look back at this period of history and see how the American nation was just split the whole time. Rahu is that. Rahu splits things. Rahu Mercury is going to split it further, I feel, because then it moves to Rahu Ketu after that. So that's going to show that further splitting, I think, apart in America. And what else is happening on top of everything else? If that wasn't enough, then we have the eclipses themselves. So Rahu, of course, creates the eclipse on April 8th. And you can see how both of those eclipses, the October 2023 and the April 8th one, cut through the US and overlap there in Texas. These are pivotal eclipses, no doubt. And I think even the April one, even more so. And the reason I'm saying that is because it's a Rahu eclipse and they're in a Rahu period, the US chart, since 2016. You can see what's happened in the US since 2016. Now it's getting triggered again with Rahu in the fifth whole sign of the chart. If I go back in Pisces, eclipsing the sun, the 10th whole sign, the leader is eclipsed in the fifth sign. The fifth sign is the change of leadership. The fifth sign is the eighth from the 10th. Eighth house is all about change. Something is happening here in April and onwards with the leader of the US, in other words. And there's something happening here with the US in anyway, in terms of political power, because that's what fifth house is in a country's chart. So I do think this eclipse is going to stir it up in a big way, in a big way. So to finish it, in case you needed more than all of that, to highlight the potential here for major upheaval, revolution, uprising, wars, you name it. We have Saturn conjoined Rahu before it ever meets with Neptune in Pisces. So Saturn will move into Pisces in March of 2025. Rahu will move out by May 2025. So you've got an overlap there. One's moving in, one's moving out, and they meet in April 2025. That's the beginning, I think, of things getting a bit shaky, to say the least. I think things are going to sort of loosen up at that point from that period from April. But as you can see, from May, June, July of 2025, we're going to see some major dissolving of, again, our current way of doing things, I would say. So again, and that's all, if we trace it all the way back to Pluto and Capricorn, this continual erosion of our current system, whether it's a banking system and money, whether it's governments, whether it's whatever way we work and do things, the new technology revolution, whatever it is, wars, you name it, it's all coming to an end in a sense, and a new system, a new world order essentially is being born right before our eyes at this time. So yes, that's it. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed that. I know there was a lot there. If you have any questions, oh, feel free to post below. I just want to mention my membership, my Patreon. If you'd like to sign up for a 7-day free trial, you can try it out for 7 days. No harm if you don't like it. Just try it out. And thereafter, it's $5. I only have the $5 tier left at the moment. But with $5, you get access to everything. It's just that I have higher tiers where they have access via email to ask questions each month, and I do mentorships as well. So the $5 tier, you get access to everything. You get weekday reports. I publish every week, every day of every week, actually. And I do updated transit reports. I do monthly forecast reports, and I do online discussions. I also have a Scorpio video club, much like presenting videos like this. I do share some of the secrets of prediction of Indian astrology, and also a Scorpio audio club. So that is private for patrons only. You get episodes based on different topics, and also maybe more controversial things I wouldn't be comfortable sharing on this platform. And then my favorite one is the astrophilosophy discussions. I love getting together to discuss all of the many sort of philosophical conundrums, essentially, that astrology throws up. And we get together and discuss these kinds of things. So that's patreon.com/timeline astrology. If you'd like to sign up, just a couple more things before you go. I do have a couple more presentations lined up. So again, if you're not subscribed already, subscribe and you'll hear about them. One is about World War astrology, quote unquote, because yeah, we probably won't call it a world war. But I mean, it is a world war in all but, name, I guess, at this time. And we look at the potential for that more so towards the end of this decade. Then the last one is Dystopia to Utopia. So this presentation is all about the journey from Scorpio to Aquarius, and how in traditional Indian astrology, we look at the rulership of Scorpio. Along with Mars, it's also ruled by Ketu, the south node, which represents the past. And then Aquarius is co-ruled with Saturn, Rahu, not Uranus as it is in modern times. But Rahu and Uranus are very similar in many ways as well. So it's all about innovation and invention and the future. So the journey from Scorpio to Aquarius is probably one of the most complicated journeys there is. They're in a square to each other. So this journey from the south node to the north node, essentially from Ketu to Rahu, from Pluto in a sense to Uranus. And how I want to leave it on one final note, and in a more positive way, we might say as well, because though Pluto is in Capricorn right now, Uranus moving into Taurus will trine Pluto in Capricorn. That seems to me to suggest that actually, even though that might make things happen quicker in a way, that changes happen with more ease. In fact, changes happen with more ease. So that actually might be a good thing, that we can see changes happening more easily. And things have to change, obviously, in the world right now. So this notion of going from a dystopian view of the world, which is what Scorpio is all about, to a utopia, which is what Aquarius can be about, but how also we can get sort of very dogmatic and stuck in our ways of thinking about these two things, and how it's actually not, one or the other. There isn't really such a thing as a complete dystopia or a complete utopia. And how with these signs and how we have to kind of manage these in our way of like psychologically overcoming these nodes, essentially, the Rahu and Ketu, and making peace with this sort of split that we all have in us. Rahu Ketu is this split we have in us. We're all born with it. They're always opposite in our charts. But this kind of notion of Rahu and Ketu and ruling these two signs, Scorpio and Aquarius, being in a square to each other, that's less of a split and more of a sort of conflict within us. A square aspect is a conflict that we have to resolve eventually. So anyway, you can join me for that presentation again. If you're not subscribed, subscribe below. Please like the video if you liked it. I hope you enjoyed that. Again, if you have any questions, I would love to hear your questions or comments or anything at all. And yeah, until next time.